Hi everybody, good afternoon. Thanks for coming to this new session in the Linked Open Data Special Interest Group meetings. Today we have a special guest speaker, David Newbury, who is the lead developer on a linked data project at the Carnegie Museum of Art called Art Tracks. And this talk is all about that. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. The session is being live streamed and recorded at the same time. So right now we have 33 people already logged in watching us. And there will be a portion of the talk for questions and answers at the end. So we have a couple of mics on the sides of the lecture hall. When you ask questions, please make sure to tell your name and your affiliation. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Manuel. Hi there, everybody. I'm David Newbury. I'm here from the Carnegie Museum of Art, and I'm joined here with my colleagues Costas and Louise, who are our Provenance Researcher and our Curator of Fine Arts, and also our friend Jane from the Smithsonian, who runs the Smithsonian Provenance Research Institute. I'm here today to talk to you about Art Tracks and some of the work we're doing. And in particular, I'd like to thank you all for inviting us. I'd like to thank Emmanuel for making this happen. This is a wonderful opportunity and a really, really good time for me. So Art Tracks is a project that we've been doing at the Carnegie Museum of Art for about the past 3.5, 4 years. And we're currently in what we call phase 2 of Art Tracks. But I want to walk you through some of the early history of the Art Tracks project and what it does and what it intends to do. And this is where Art Tracks started. Lulu and Costas have been working on the provenance of our museum's collection. And this is a museum audience, so I don't need to explain provenance beyond that it's the history of the ownership of the arts. And as they've been collecting this, they said, wouldn't it be wonderful to take this data and to watch the artwork move around the world in space and time, see where it's been, where it's going, how it got there. And they called me up and said, David, can you do this? And I have a background in animation and computer science and data visualization. And I said, oh, that sounds like fun. I've done maps, I've done timelines. This shouldn't be a problem at all. I told them it would take 6 months. I thought it would take about 3 weeks. Gave myself a little bit of cushion. It's now 3.5 years later. And the reason that it took so much longer, and it is taking so much longer than I thought, is because provenance is really, really rich information. There's incredible stories in there. There's an incredible depth of research. But it looks like this. And what this is this is a paragraph of text designed to let experts who understand this data already extract the nuance and meaning from one of their colleagues. There's structure that conveys information, but this is not data. This is not something that a computer can understand. It's words that come in order, it's sentences, and this is the sort of stuff that computers hate because they don't understand what, until at least 1930 means. You know what that means because you're a reasonable human being, but computers don't. And so we sat down and said, with the help of my colleagues, if I made let's make a spreadsheet. Let's do this, I'll put the columns in, you put the rows in, we'll be fine. And as we started pulling apart each one of these periods of ownership, we realized that that spreadsheet had 50 columns, and we had hundreds of thousands of rows for our collection. And we realized that we were never, ever going to get any of our researchers to fill in this incredibly detailed spreadsheet. They care about the data, but the workload was so high that it would never happen. And so instead, what we did is we worked collaboratively on a piece of software, which we call Museum Provenance. And this is a text parser. We said, I wonder what would happen if we considered it like a citation, or even more like a programming language, where every word in that provenance had meaning. And if we put those words and their meanings in the right order, I bet the computer could pull it apart and put it back together. And it means we have to be more precise in the way we write, but we can write provenance the way that we've always written it. And we can take that and turn it into the data that people like I need, or data visualization needs, or the digital humanities needs. And it turns out that that's actually a possible thing to do. It took a lot of work, it took a lot of compromise between the two of us, because I had to realize that there's a lot more nuance in provenance than I possibly could have understood. And Costas, the researcher, had to teach me slowly what each one of these things meant, and put up with my horrible questions like, when you say London, England, what do you actually mean? And it's, what's the connection between London and the person and the artwork? And as we talked through it, we realized that we didn't, that understanding that we thought we all had about provenance was not as fixed as we thought it had been. And so what we built was this user interface for people. And this is a form-based tool for writing provenance, where you have little drop-down boxes and you have fields you can fill in, and it helps humans write provenance. Because the real rich part of it is the research that has to happen. If we can automate the writing and so that other people can do it and other people can understand it, it will be helpful. And it lets us represent provenance in 3 ways. First, it lets us represent it as that paragraph of text with each of the periods of ownership and their associated notes pulled together. And this is how the traditional researcher looks at provenance and how they understand it. It also gives us a form, fields like this, where you can say, I want to change the party location and change it from London to Paris, or from London to New York, or change the acquisition from gift to purchase, or to bequest. And this is a quicker way for people to edit provenance. And finally, what it enables are visualizations of that history of ownership, where you can actually see the artwork change over time. And you can see periods of certainty in black and periods of uncertainty in gray. And you can watch this move through space and time and recognize things that you didn't see previously. And finally, what this enables are the sort of rich data visualizations that we wanted to start with, where you can actually look at the map and watch the painting move through space and time. And this took about 2 years, and at the end of 2015, we had done this project, we'd presented this project to some colleagues. We thought we'd done a really interesting project. And everyone came to us and said, okay, what are you going to do next? And they also said, how do we do this? And we realized that the answer to that question was, you work at the Carnegie and you hang out with us. And we realized that that wasn't really a scalable answer. We couldn't all get into one room and talk it through. And the things that I understood, I couldn't just say, oh, you hire me and I talk to you about it. We needed to make this something that was actually usable by other people. And we also learned as we were doing this that there were a bunch of things that we wished it did, but that it wasn't capable of doing. And so we realized that what we needed to do was formalize it. Say, let's document this well enough that I can teach you how to do this in a lecture, not 3 months of close collaboration. And let's build it so that it works across museums, because all the stories we really wanted to tell connected the museum collections of multiple people. And we realized that we also wanted to use linked data as a way to start formalizing these connections between events in history. And that's really what the next part of this is about, is why do museums need linked data? And in particular, when they're thinking about their collections, museums have lots and lots of roles. Museums are places for visitors and for engagement. And museums are places of preservation and conservation of objects. But in particular, I'm talking about the scholarship and the historical significance and that collection-based role that museums play. And I'm not here to talk about linked open data. I'm not here to talk about whether or not we should share our data. I know Yale is fantastic at this, and my assumption is that if you are a museum and you are interested in fostering scholarship, you are sharing your data. There's been lots of people talking about that. We had a wonderful conversation at the Carnegie about 2 weeks ago where one of our staff members said, do we need to talk about this? And the entire rest of the team said, why would we talk about that? We've been talking about that for a decade. The answer is solved. We share our data. And so this is not that talk. But the question is, why do museums share their data? What are we hoping to get out of sharing our information with the public? And that's a much more interesting question to me than should we. So are museums publishers? Yes, I think museums are publishers, but we don't just take the information that people have put together and format it and make it pretty and present it to the public. We do more than just that. And are museums researchers? Yes, but we don't research everything. We're not academics. We don't go out and pursue scholarship based on our personal interests. We research the objects and the connections and the things which are relevant to our collection and our purpose. Because that's what museums are, in my opinion, fundamentally. Museums are collections of objects, and that provides a circle around which we do our work and an area, a focus for what we do. We're interested in researching, collecting, and preserving information about our objects, but also the events and the people and the topics that surround our objects and that give them context and give them meaning and connect them to the rest of the world. And that's where linked data comes in. And this is the promise of linked data, that the creation of a common framework that allows data to be shared and reused across application and community boundaries, to be processed automatically by tools, revealing new relationships and new data. This has been the promise of linked data since people started talking about it in the early 2000s. And my question is, where is this magical future? Where is this world where the automated tools create knowledge for us and put us all out of our jobs? It turns out that linked data doesn't do what we thought it was going to do. It doesn't enable web-scale artificial intelligence. There is no giant robot out in the cloud that is deciding what the history of art was and should have been and telling it to us. That's not how linked data works. And linked data doesn't make it easy for us to collaborate. It doesn't automate that process of finding connections between you and between me. It doesn't even automate when I talk about Monet and you talk about Monet, that our Monets are the same sort of people. And in general, what it doesn't do is reduce the amount of work that we have to do. These are the promises that I heard when I started hearing about linked data. And as I've worked with it, I've learned that this is not what linked data does. The thing is, if that was all that I came out of after 4 years of playing with linked data, this would be a short talk. I would say, go back to your jobs, do what you're going to do. This was a failed experiment. We can all go home. But that isn't what I learned. What I learned is that linked data isn't some sort of magic bullet. It's one of a bunch of different possible ways to think about the data that you guys are creating. And they all have trade-offs. Linked data has trade-offs, but it also has benefits that are really hard to access any other way. Anything you can do with data, you can probably do in any one of these ways. And so what I want to talk about is, through art tracks and through what we've been doing for the past year and a half, and what we're going to continue to do for the next year, talk about what we're doing, why it's useful, and how linked data helps us actually accomplish those things that we want to do, what the actual benefits of linked data are. And so we are currently in Art Tracks Phase 2. And it is about standardization and formalization of the project that we did previously. Let's figure out how to take this information that we have in the text, add to it the parts that we didn't know how to do 2 years ago. Let's figure out how to express that as JSON, as a format that is used on the web and that is collaborative, and that developers like me understand and can build things off of. And let's figure out how to build it as linked open data in this rich semantic framework. And let's figure out how to interchange between all three of these so that the text and the JSON and the semantic thing are all available with different trade-offs for different people. Because what museums have is they have these content management systems where you do your research, you put all of your information, and you store it. And what we really want to get to is shared online scholarship. This is why we publish collections websites. This is why we do our research. This is why we create these online catalogs, so that we can share our scholarship and we can share in the act of scholarship with people around the world. This is the promise of the 21st century, the promise of digital technologies, that we can share this sort of work. Then we have linked data, which is what we're talking about, and we're trying to figure out what role it can play in this process. But the other thing we're talking about here are documents and about graphs. These are two different shapes for the same kind of content. They hold information in different forms. People are really good at documents. Computers are really good at graphs. And in particular, computers are really good at representing those graphs in JSON, which is simple and parsable and understandable. And so if I think about it, this is the model that we have. We have our documents, which is what comes out of our content management system, what we use to understand that. And we have our JSON, which is what we're going to use to feed out to the web, that we're going to give to our developers. We're going to give to those contractors and collaborators who want to build the in-gallery experiences that we hope can be done with digital technology. And we have the linked data, which is there for things that we don't know what are yet, for research projects that we can't understand because we can't conceptualize them yet, but that take that research that we've already done and put it in a form where as much of the nuance of the scholarship is still contained. And so we started thinking, if we're going to do this for provenance, what are the pieces that we need to tell this story? And if anyone here has ever worked with museum data, you know about tombstone data. We have Mary Cassatt, we have the work, we have our museum. And they're connected. This is the base level of what museum data is. There's lots of other things that hang off of this for lots of other things, but for the context of provenance, these are the important things. Who owns it today? Who created it? And what is the thing? And these are those core entities. It's not even provenance here. This is just the ground truth for what we're talking about. And what basic provenance is that plus a block of text that says this written history that the researchers have created. And there's two things here. We have the document, which is the text, and then we also have the events that that text describes. And so when I think about provenance, I realize that we're talking about two things that are happening in parallel. One is this written document that contains the research about those events, and the other one is this timeline of events that took place in the history of an object. And they go in parallel and they talk about each other, but they're not the same thing. And so that has been one of these transformative things that we've understood. And people like me, when I see these things, I want to start simplifying away. I want to start saying we can treat them as the same thing. And this is where my humanities colleagues and my research colleagues start explaining to me that every time I try to simplify away these nuances, I lose information that they carefully put in there. That the name that they wrote down of the previous owner was not, they put something down just so they would remember who that person was, but they wrote it down in the form and with the spelling because it means something to them. Maybe it's the context, how it was written in the historic document that they pulled that text from. Maybe it was the title that that person owned when they acquired the work, but not the title that they're most commonly known by. Maybe it's a maiden name of someone who was later married. That these things have context and meaning, and I can't express all of it through the data because we'd have to document everything about humans. So keeping the document around to keep that nuance the researcher has developed is really important. The second level of provenance that we talk about is provenance with entities. And what we want to do here is, as I'm thinking about how do I make provenance useful for people doing scholarship, having the text is really useful because you can read it. But often you want to know what was everything that was in the collection of Charles Rosenblum? What was everything that was ever in New York? What was everything that was connected to these people and places and documents that bring them together? And at this point, we still don't really need linked data. What we need is something that can read the text. It doesn't have to understand it, but it can say, this is a name, this is a place, this is a document, this is an event. And the thing is that we don't have to own all of those people to make this useful. We just have to go out and link to them. We have to talk to them. So this is one of the first things that linked data enables really nicely, is this linking to other authorities. And this is one of these topics that comes up a lot at museums. It's this concept of authorities and identities and trust. When I say that Mary Cassatt created this painting, I am asserting something about the universe. I'm making a statement of fact. And if I'm a museum, I'm doing that as an authority on that painting. Because I'm the source of truth for that painting. It's in my collection, and it's my job as a museum to be that authority. The problem is that authority isn't free. The act of making that assertion and backing it up and publishing it and defending it takes time and resources and research. And it's what we should be doing as a museum, but it isn't the only thing we have to do. And the world is this enormous place, and as we start making more and more connections from our objects to everything else in the entire world that they affect, we start running into this problem that to fully describe our objects, we are fully describing the entire world. And the other problem with that is our budgets are not as big as the entire world. We can't be the authority for everything in the entire universe as a museum. It's too big of a load, no matter how big your museum is or how few objects you own. And so how can we be authoritative without being encyclopedic? How can we own the things that we want to own and talk about them with the authority of our research and our passion, but not need to do it for everything in the entire world? And I think about this through three things. The first is there should be this concept of asserted authority, where I come out and I say, I would like to be the authority on this topic. I'd like to be the authority for our works of art. I'd like to be the authority for the events and exhibitions that happened in my building. These are the things where I'm the best person in the world to do it, and so I'm going to go out and say, I'm the right person to be the authority on this topic. And then there's other things that I want to delegate. I don't need to be the expert on Van Gogh. There are lots of people who are better at it, who know more than me, and so I'm going to delegate that authority to them. I'm going to point to someone that I trust and say, when I talk about Van Gogh, I trust the Van Gogh Museum to talk about Van Gogh, or I trust Getty Uland's record for Van Gogh to be good enough for what I'm doing that they can be the authority on that. I don't have to own it, and so the amount of work I have to do goes down. And lastly, there's this concept of reluctant authority, and this is the Local Heroes Project. There are people where I don't think that I am qualified to be the authority on it. These are the collectors that came through our institution. These are the obscure artists that aren't in other people's databases, where I have to be the authority temporarily because nobody else has taken this responsibility, but I'm prepared. If a person who is more qualified comes along and wants to be the authority, I will happily delegate it out. This is temporary authority held out of necessity, not out of desire. And so coming out of our Art Tracks project, we've been talking about how do we enable ourselves and other people to build tools to do this. And so we're putting together tools that help us spin up small authority files, baby Ulans, for those things that we want to be a reluctant authority for. And the third level of provenance is event-based provenance, where we now start understanding the text. We start pulling apart the individual events that make up provenance as a history. And we start treating each period of ownership as something that you can do. And we start interpreting this text to say, these are the events, they have meaning, the parts of it have meaning. We now understand this not as text and not as text that links out to names, but as a description of those events. And the problem that we have with this, and that linked data helps us, is this idea of shared semantics, of when I say something and when you say something, we both know we're saying the same thing. So if I have JSON data, and I don't expect anyone to read this or understand this, this is understandable if you're me, because I wrote this. And so when I say something like, transfer location, place string is Pittsburgh, PA, that means something very specific to me in the context of our provenance. But without you being me, there's no way that you could know that that is what I mean. And when I say that the acquisition method is acquisition sale, there's no way that you could know what that means without me explaining it to you. And what linked data lets us do is it says, there should be documentation that when I say, this thing was the transfer of custody from this person to this person, we should have a shared understanding of what that means. And I don't know about you guys, but I hate writing documentation. I hate writing descriptions of what I do. And so the more places where I can find someone who has already done this, someone has said, when I say transfer of custody, I mean this. That's where linked data and ontologies and shared vocabularies become really useful, because they let me be lazy and do that work of finding someone who's already said the thing I want to say and saying what that person said. And it means that if you do the same thing because you're lazy and you say what that person said, all of a sudden we work together really nicely. And even if we don't, I can just say, well, if you don't understand, go read this thing that someone wrote and that smart people have reviewed. And it means that I can end up with a data structure that looks remarkably similar to that first one, where it's the same sort of data, it's the same sort of fields that we had previously, but now using something like JSON LD, which is a linked data format, and the CDOC CRM, which is an ontology that describes it. This is the same data, but it's represented in a way that's slightly more complicated, but all of that complexity is documented and understandable, and any part you don't understand, you can go and look up. Nothing is comprehensive is part of the problem here. There is no shared vocabulary. Much like we were talking about authorities, I can't delegate everything because sometimes the topic I'm interested in is more specific than I can get to. And so sometimes I have to do that hard work of documentation. I have to describe concepts that nobody else has cared enough about to do that work for me. And so this is another one of the projects that's coming out of the art tracks. And what I've realized throughout all of art tracks is that what we're doing is we're building a set of small tools, which you can take parts and not parts, and put them together to help do this. But as I build the parts that we need, we're sharing them out so other people don't have to solve these same problems. And so this is a hierarchy of ways that art changes hands. And it's been put together through the collaborations that I've had with the Yale Center for British Art and the collaborations with the Freer-Sackler, collaborations with the Getty Provenance Index to help find ways that art changes hands and do that really hard work of documenting what I think all of these means. And this is not comprehensive yet, this is not finished yet, but this is a first pass, so at least we all have something to fight about. And we can look at the documentation and we can say, we disagree about this, and we can have those discussions. It's a starting point for describing the way that art changes hands. And so as we're thinking about this, for each one of these events, there's all sorts of pieces of data that we can capture for each one. We can capture the actual text, we can capture footnotes and acquisition methods and citations. We can also start documenting the individual transactions where purchases took place, and lot numbers, and purchase amounts, and the currency it changed place in, and the agents who facilitated that transaction. But the thing is, I don't know that as a museum we're the right people to exhaustively document that kind of thing. This is an area where I would like to delegate. And so this leads me to reason 3 for linked data, which is something I'm thinking about as minimum viable collaboration. So we've been putting together this model for provenance, and it's an object-based provenance. We have this object, it changes hands over time in this way. It describes the life history of that object. Our friends at the Getty have been working on their Getty Provenance Index Remodel project, where they are interested in documenting dealer stock books and auction catalogs using linked data. These are really parallel projects, but they're interested in these big horizontal slices of work, and we're interested in these long vertical chains. And they touch when one of our objects went through one of their sales. And we want to be able to collaborate so that we don't both have to document everything about both of these. And this is where linked data becomes really, really useful. If we think about a lot of the tools designed for aggregation, things like Lido or things like CDWA, they're designed to find that wonderful sweet spot between lots of projects where we all share the same information. And we can document it in the same way, and we can collaborate that way through a shared understanding of that core that makes us all the same. But the promise of linked data is if we can collaborate and find out what the smallest possible, and so when you have one of these consistent schemas, you want that middle to be as big as possible. So there's as many things that we share in common as possible. When you're doing linked data, you want that middle part to be as small as possible. So I can link out to the Getty, and we have to just agree on how the things that we're going to link together. And everything else can be out there connected, and I can find out if I care about it. But it turns out I don't care about hammer price versus bid price versus asking price versus selling price. I don't tend to care about the percentages of ownerships when it was at the dealer. These are things they care passionately about, and there are researchers who care about those things. But if we can let them document that and find a way that we can collaborate with them using the smallest possible intersection, linked data will enable that kind of collaboration. And so we have this provenance model that talks about 3 different levels of provenance. About basic provenance, which is just text, about annotated provenance, which links to the people, and event-based provenance, which links out to the individual events and breaks it apart. And that's what we're thinking about with the tools that Carnegie is building. But that's not the limit of ways you can think about provenance. There can be a 4th level of provenance. And this is reason 4 for using linked data, which is the unattainability of complete knowledge. I can't know everything. I can't design something that will accommodate everything that the researchers are going to find. Deeper data, richer data, more sophisticated data. For instance, if I say that Joe owns a painting and he sells it to Sally, we have this event, which is the transaction where it goes from one person to the other. But we all know that what really happens is Joe has it, he puts it on deposit at a gallery, the shipper then takes it to the gallery, it stays at the gallery for a while, it's in storage for a week, it then goes on a truck and it's delivered to Sally. There's this whole set of events that make up that purchase. And I don't know about you, but we don't document our provenance to that level of specificity at this point. But I could imagine somebody doing it in the future. And so that's the last thing that linked data enables us, is that we can get to the level that we want, knowing that it could be deeper, knowing it could be more complex, and we can build on this framework to go deeper into what we care about. And so those are the reasons I think linked data is actually useful, and it's practical based on what we've learned from trying to build the ArtTracks project, is that shared authority is a really powerful way for museums to collaborate with each other. That a shared understanding of the terms and the concepts that we use make it easier for us to work together because we can talk using the same words and the same language and the same understandings. That it lets us collaborate together more easily because we don't have to agree on everything. We just have to find an area where we agree and areas where it's okay if we disagree, if we have different areas that I care about and you don't care about. I've done a little bit of work with the Autry Museum, which is about the American West, and the National Wildlife Museum, which is about wildlife. And they want to collaborate, but the Autry has amazing documentation of Native American tribes and names. And the Wildlife Museum has amazing documentation about the scientific names of the animals which are represented in their artworks. And if we can say you two can collaborate without throwing away those things that make you unique, we can collaborate more effectively. And the last thing we care about is planning for the future. We know that you researchers are never going to stop researching. The work of a museum is never done. And as your data gets richer and better, we don't want to lock ourselves into a framework that was good enough for today, but not good enough for tomorrow. And so now the question is, what comes next? What is the future of our work? We have software to do a lot of these things. We're in the process of rebuilding our interface to use this new software, and we're in the process of building collaborative tools. And the next thing we want to work on is this idea of how do we use this to do the sort of scholarship that could be previously undoable. And so we're starting a project which we're calling the Northbrook Project, where we take, these are 7 works in the Carnegie's collection, which all pass through the collection of the Earls of Northbrook, who were the Baring family, who were the family that owned Baring Bank, had an amazing old masters collection. And through the research that Costas has done, all 7 of these were in that collection. When that collection was dispersed through 5 different people came to the Carnegie. And what we're interested in is, can we use these sorts of collaborative linked data tools to reconstruct a collection like this? And so that's the next project we're going to work on using these tools. Can we prove practically that it's useful for doing the sort of scholarly research that we want to do with linked data? And can we do it collaboratively using tools, using other museums, making these links out to other authorities? And so this is our next research project that we're embarking on. And it's wonderful because YCBA has works from the Northbrook Collection, and our friends at the Smithsonian have works from the Northbrook Collection, and 50 other museums across the world do. And so we can call them up and say, you have this one work. Are you willing to try out these tools and these techniques and these ideas with one work? And we'll build you a scholarly portal that will then show your research to the world and expose you to the potential that this sort of linked data work has. So, as always, it's really important for me to thank the people who've made this work possible. It was originally funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We're currently operating under a wonderful NEH grant, and along with additional support from CREST to do a research project around Nazi-era provenance, and the Paul Mellon Center for British Art to build out this Northbrook catalog. So again, thank you all for coming, thank you for listening. If I can invite Emmanuel and my colleagues from the Carnegie to come up, we're here to answer questions and to talk through anything that you feel like I left out. So thank you.
That would be a good time. So maybe to get us started here, maybe David and Lulu, maybe do you want to explain how this fits into, give us a little bit of context in terms of the NEH grant. I didn't throw that in there at the beginning of the talk. I think give us some timeline, yeah.
Right. The main purpose of the NEH grant was to further this idea that through standardizing provenance data, we would be able to share it with other organizations. And that was the aspect of this project that NEH found most interesting and appealing. And the Northbrook Project that we're working on now is a sort of proof of concept. It was a combination of finding something in our collection that was interesting and could be developed further, and then creating a product with which we would literally bribe our museum colleagues to participate. And so, we have identified, say, 300 works out of a collection of 500? Yeah. And we have identified at least 50 institutions as well as private owners. We will be contacting them and saying, please contribute your data. Would you be willing to contribute your data? We are offering them a reward if they do so, which is that we will then share the gallery interactive programs that David's going to write so that they can deploy them in their own spaces and adapt it for their own collections. And so it's a way of working with museum colleagues as a way of demonstrating to audiences of many kinds that this information is not simply academic fact gathering, but is in fact of use for museums and the public.
And the other important part of this collaboration is, as we start talking about standardizing provenance, we realized that the data in our collection is very, very geared to both the sort of collecting our museum has done and the way that we've documented it. And so we asked Yale Center for British Art and the Vera Sackler Gallery at the Smithsonian to join us in this project because their collections and their collecting patterns and their research habits are different enough that we wouldn't get locked into standardizing data in a way that only describes the nuances of how we do it. And it's been really, really helpful learning about the way that, say, Asian art collection patterns differ from our somewhat contemporary, or the way that your classic, more British-inspired provenance is documented in researches as compared to ours. So it's been really helpful to have these collaborators, and Emmanuel taught me everything I know about linked data, and so it's been wonderful having her to help.
Thank you. But it's certainly true that it seems to me that lately there's been a very good trend at those collaborative projects and solving problems, just to state the obvious, but solving the problems with several brains is just much easier, and certainly makes for a project that's expandable much more easily, right? You're not working in a silo anymore. I see several hands going up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Forgive me if this sounds a little bit of a lay question, but the advantages of having this standardized format to keep this data versus looking something up on Wikipedia is that any museum, no matter what their collections are, they can pull data and apply it. They can group data. Let's say they're searching for something and trying to find what comes up for a very specific question. Then they can apply it into their own digital environment, whatever that may be, or digital application, versus extracting the data one by one out of a Wikipedia?
Yes, and what it starts letting us do is ask these questions that are hard. If I want to know where an artwork was, the text that the researchers have put together is sufficient to answer that question. But if I want to say, how do works move from Europe to North America? Or how did the Napoleonic Wars affect the art markets in Amsterdam? To answer those questions, I need pools of data that extend through many, many objects. And so having a way to use computer technology to do searches across large sets that's the value of this standardized data, of structured data.
Thank you.
If you look in the literature, if you look at websites, each institution has a different way of recording provenance information, and also different ways of reporting exhibition histories. What David is after is a common language. After very long discussions, we've come up with a pretty logical alternative that would standardize this kind of provenance texts. And I think that's at the beginning of what can happen with linked data. That's the basis.
Thanks very much. I'm wondering about a broader cultural context, I guess, for these questions. In other words, are you getting buy-in from museums? I mean, in many instances, I think a lot of this provenance data is very much considered proprietary and can expose institutions to questions of legitimacy of ownership and authenticity. And I'm wondering how you're managing those kinds of issues.
Okay. I think that one of a stimulus for this project in a very remote way was the change of attitudes towards Nazi-era provenance. Every museum in the European, American world that collects European art has been forced to redo their provenances in the last 20 or 30 years as a result of that change of attitude, both ethical and legal. As a result, provenance is an incredibly rich source it's one of the richest and most consistent bodies of information in the museum field, even though it's not perfect. And part of the ethical requirement was that we publish this data. So the switch in the field from keeping it secret to disclosure has happened and is happening. And as a result, when David has talked about his work, it's not about making it happen, it's about making it easier. At the moment, the biggest barrier to furthering this is the amount of time it takes to basically hand make the data, and the cost of the researchers to do that work. So the barriers have shifted on that, and more the attitude in museums is towards making this data publicly available and accessible, and this extends beyond provenance, things like images and the other information about objects.
I think a lot of it is that if you're going to publish your problematic records already, it's in your best interest to publish all the ones that aren't problematic so that other people can see that you aren't only holding this terrible looted art, you have amazing histories that tell stories. And if we can take provenance from being about looted art or about Nazis to being about the rich history of collecting in America, it makes our work easier and our position as a museum more sustainable and understandable.
Even though the point you have just made is very accurate, because a lot of museums on their website still only publish works that have potential gaps, rather than publishing all of their data. So.
Thanks, David, for a great talk, and a question maybe initially aimed at you, but I would appreciate anybody else's thoughts on this. Any thought to using natural language processing tools to try to extract latent relationships from this kind of English language narrative, to at least provide a rough draft that curators could then edit? Because there are, there are verbs, there are subjects in there. Would that give you a rough draft you could then try to more formally express in RDF?
We started playing around with that natural language parsing as the first, that was the first way I tried to do this. And the two things I realized were, when it fails, it's almost impossible to explain to curators why it failed, why it thinks that, this person's name is actually a location. And the other thing I realized is that because it is so statistical, it's not as reproducible as a stricter parsing system. And they cared enormously about me not changing anything they'd actually written. So if something worked one way but didn't work the same way the next time, they said, we aren't going to touch this. So I think there is still a use for that kind of technology, and as you say, as hints. When there are things that the computer can't understand, using that to say, did you mean this? But it's always about humans making decisions. I don't want the computer to make decisions for the people.
I think in our long discussions about standardizing this process, all three of us have made compromises in order to be able to work together, because our requirements in the beginning were very different than David's requirements.
And this also gets back to the previous question about legitimacy of ownership. In other words, we didn't want to put our human-created data through a computer program and have the information come out incorrect, because it's more, the provenance is interesting and necessary, but it is also the basis for our legal ownership of an object. So we did not want, and we didn't think we would get anyone to collaborate with us if there was any risk that their data could be corrupted by the standardization process. So not corrupting the data was an incredibly high standard for David's work.
Though if you know enough to ask that question, the project I want somebody to do who isn't me is, what we're doing is we're creating an amazing corpus for training natural language parsing, or NLP toolkits for provenance. And so we now have this set of structured data that is also textual data, tagged phrases that you could use to build a really amazing tool to do the kind of work you're talking about doing. We just haven't done it yet. And it's not my strength.
This really puts the question of trust to the foreground, really. Going from carefully crafted human narratives into now computer-readable language. And that's certainly something we're very aware of here, is that the story at the end of this data transformation process should be exactly the same as what went in. So this type of collaboration at the Carnegie is really fantastic, because we see three aspects of one problem coming together and still be very careful about the end story. That's certainly something we like a lot.
And this project would never have been successful if I hadn't had collaborators like Costas and Lulu, because they've been patient with me for 3 years to explain why this is important and what parts of it are important. And without that kind of detailed understanding of the humanities practice, without all of the lunches and all of the coffees and all of the sitting down and listening through my crazy ideas about how to do this, this would never be successful. This is not a digital project. This is a collaborative museum project. We use digital technologies, but we also use
art history experience and provenance experience to build it. And you can't do a digital project like this without the expertise of the subject.
And without failing the first time, I guess. I mean, the first time we put the data through, we got back a whole bunch of interesting things. It's like Chanel number 1 through 4. What happened to them?
Any more questions? It might be a good time then to talk about the November 6th symposium that you're organizing at the Carnegie Museum.
Right. I think there will be a number of outcomes of this Northbrook project that will be sort of proof of concept on multiple levels. In the most museum sort of centric part of it, we are going to be designing a gallery that will include the 7 pictures that David showed you, and that will also showcase the technologies for our museum visitors to interact with as a way of testing whether this kind of research can lead to a new form of, a new way to engage visitors in the objects and the museum's history and its collections. We will also be creating a scholarly website where all of the research and documentation of the history of the entire collection will be available online in the hopes that other scholars will continue to make use of these resources. We are also hosting a conference at the museum on November the 6th, 2017. Our gallery will be open, the interactive will be displayed, and it will be a one-day conference which will feature updates from our project and related projects using museums data in this fashion. And in the afternoon, we're hoping to have a more sort of wide open discussion about how museum data can play in the field of digital humanities and how digital humanities can shape the way museums interpret and present their collections. So stay tuned. Manuel has all the information, and you can also get it on David's website, museumprovenance.org. So stay tuned.
Great. Any parting words from you guys?
It's been great to be here. I graduated from here ages and ages and ages ago. It's wonderful to come back and be a speaker and to see how the things that got me excited as an undergraduate continue to happen here. So thank you, Emmanuel, for offering us this opportunity, and we've benefited a lot.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure having you around. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you all.
Honor.